At 5 in the morning, when the airport was still buried in fog, CEO Vivian Blackthorne laughed out loud at the sight of a single father in a faded jacket bending low near the security fence, picking through trash like a man searching for spare change. She assumed Caleb Rowan was nothing more than a scavenger looking for scrap metal to sell, until he reached into a drainage ditch and pulled out a scorched metal box caked in mud, still bearing the flight number of the plane that had killed her father 12 years earlier. Vivian went pale and silent. The black box had vanished from every official record, and the only man who should have known where it was buried had been dead for over a decade. If you want to see how far a family will go to protect a name and how far one overlooked man will go to protect the truth, stay until the end, because what Caleb pulled out of the ground that morning would cost the Blackthorne Empire everything it had spent 12 years building on a lie. At 5 in the morning, the runways of Ashford International Airport were still wrapped in a gray, wet fog that clung to the ground lights and made the whole tarmac look like something underwater. The air smelled of jet fuel and last night's rain, and the only sounds were the distant hum of an idling tug and the occasional crackle of a radio somewhere near the hangars. Vivian Blackthorne arrived in a black car with tinted windows, dressed for a day that would define her career, because in a few hours the press, the board, and every major investor in the country would be watching the first public test flight of the Blackthorne Vesper X9. She had rehearsed her opening remarks twice in the car, checked her phone 11 times, and reminded her assistant twice that nothing could go wrong before 9 o'clock. She stepped out into the cold and pulled her coat tighter, watching her own breath curl into the fog, and for a moment the enormity of the morning pressed down on her chest like something physical. Everything about her life had been built toward mornings like this one, polished and controlled, every variable accounted for in advance. She did not yet know that the variable she had failed to account for was crouched less than 200 feet away, quietly reshaping the ground beneath everything she believed about her family. As she crossed the access road near the ground vehicle bay, she saw a man in a reflective jacket crouched near the perimeter fence, moving slowly along the gravel, lifting small objects and dropping them into a bucket. His posture was careful, almost reverent, the way a man moves when he is handling something he respects rather than something he is disposing of. Vivian slowed her pace without meaning to, curious despite herself, and watched him for a moment before her patience ran out and her old habits took over. She called out that the airport was not a scrapyard for people looking to make a few extra dollars before sunrise, and the words came out sharper than she intended, laced with the particular disdain of someone who had never once had to count what was in her wallet. Caleb did not straighten up right away. He finished lifting a small piece of twisted metal from the gravel, turned it once in his gloved hand, and only then looked up at her with an expression that held no anger at all. He told her, evenly, that a single loose fastener could be pulled into an engine intake and destroy a turbine worth millions of dollars in under 2 seconds, and that this was the actual reason he was there before the sun came up. Vivian felt something close to embarrassment, though she would not have called it that at the time, because it seemed absurd that a groundskeeper in a faded jacket was explaining foreign object debris to the chief executive of an aerospace company. She pressed on anyway, telling him she did not need a lecture from a sanitation worker about the safety of her own airline. Caleb simply nodded, unbothered, and returned his attention to the fence line, moving another few feet down the gravel with the same unhurried care. It was then that he noticed a flash of burnt orange color half buried in a drainage channel that the previous night's storm had washed open, the mud around it still loose and dark from the runoff. He crouched, extended a long-handled hook he carried for exactly this purpose, and drew the object slowly out of the sediment, careful not to scrape it against the concrete edge. What emerged was not a can or a bottle or any of the ordinary debris he collected each morning. It was a heat-resistant metal casing, blackened along one edge, dented but intact, with a strip of lettering still faintly visible beneath the grime. Caleb wiped a thumb across the casing and felt his pulse change before his mind had even finished the thought, because he recognized the shape and the mounting bracket instantly from another life he had tried very hard to leave behind. Vivian stepped closer without realizing she had moved at all, drawn by the sudden stillness in his posture, and when she saw the partial serial code beneath the mud, the letters and numbers that spelled out BTA 417, her breath caught somewhere behind her ribs. That was the tail number of the aircraft that had carried her father to his death 12 years earlier, a number she had memorized the way other people memorize a birthday, because she had spent over a decade trying to forget it and never once succeeding. Caleb looked up at her, his expression no longer guarded but grave, and told her plainly that this device had never actually been lost in the crash the way the official reports claimed. Someone, he said, had carried it back onto airport grounds themselves. Vivian's first instinct was ownership, sharp and immediate, the same instinct that had governed every decision of her adult life. She told Caleb the device belonged to Blackthorn Aeronautics and asked him to hand it over so her security team could take custody of it. He refused calmly but without hesitation, explaining that this was evidence in a fatal accident investigation and needed to be handled through a proper chain of custody, not passed quietly into the hands of the very company whose plane had gone down. Vivian's jaw tightened and she accused him, in a voice colder than she intended, of trying to extort money from her family by exploiting a tragedy that had nothing to do with him. Caleb did not raise his voice or defend himself with any urgency. Instead, he took out his phone, photographed the exact location where the casing had been recovered, noted the time, and asked a passing maintenance worker to witness the discovery before anyone touched the device again. It was a small, procedural act, but it told Vivian something important about the man in front of her, something that did not match the story she had already built about him in her head. Within minutes, the airport's director of security, Owen Danner, arrived at the scene, moving faster than a man his age should have been able to move before 6 in the morning. His face changed the instant he saw the casing in Caleb's gloved hands, a flicker of recognition that passed too quickly for Vivian to name, but not quickly enough for Caleb to miss entirely. Owen immediately suggested the device be brought to internal airport security rather than reported to federal investigators, insisting it would be faster and less disruptive to the morning's test flight schedule. Caleb noticed that Owen handled the request with a strange familiarity, speaking about the casing's weight and shape before the mud had even been fully wiped away, as though he had held something very much like it before. Vivian, still reeling, found herself watching Caleb rather than Owen, unsettled by how easily he identified the housing, the underwater locator mechanism, and the internal memory board without a single hesitation in his voice. When she asked where a man who spent his mornings collecting debris had learned to speak with such precision about black box components, Caleb only said that he had once worked with systems very much like it. Meanwhile, without drawing attention to himself, Owen quietly radioed a request to disable the security cameras near the drainage access point, citing routine maintenance as the reason. Vivian wanted the entire matter contained, buried beneath the noise of the Vesper X9 launch, because she could not afford a scandal on the single most important morning of her professional life. Caleb warned her, without softening the words, that concealing the device a second time could make her complicit in whatever had happened the first time it disappeared. The sentence landed exactly where he intended it to, striking the deepest fear Vivian carried, the fear that she might become the person who damaged her father's legacy rather than the one who protected it. After a long pause, she agreed to have the device sealed and transported to an independent recovery laboratory run by a forensic specialist named Dr. Elise Vance, someone with no ties to Blackthorn Aeronautics at all. Before Owen left the tarmac, he stepped away from the group and made a quiet call on his personal phone, his voice low enough that only the fog seemed to hear him say that the thing they had buried 12 years ago had just been found. In the days that followed, Vivian instructed her legal department to run a full background check on Caleb Rowan, telling herself it was simple due diligence and nothing more. What came back stopped her cold because the file showed that Caleb had once been an avionics technician at Blackthorn Aeronautics, employed there for nearly 6 years before his termination, just days after her father's crash. The official record claimed he had been dismissed for falsifying an inspection report, a serious enough offense that it had followed him out of the aviation industry entirely. Vivian's first assumption was the obvious one, that a bitter former employee had engineered the discovery of the black box as an act of long-delayed revenge against the company that fired him. She drove out to the maintenance yard herself and confronted Caleb directly, asking him without preamble whether he had staged the entire discovery to settle an old score. Caleb did not deny his history with the company, but he was equally direct in telling her that his personnel file had been altered after the fact. He explained that in the weeks before the crash, he had flagged unusual feedback signals coming from the flight control actuator, responsible for stabilizing the aircraft's wing surfaces, signals that suggested a component failure waiting to happen. He had filed 3 separate reports through the proper channels, he said, and 2 of them had simply vanished from the system, while the third had been quietly rewritten to state the opposite of what he had actually found. The day he lost his job was the same day his access credentials were revoked, locking him out of every system before he could even attempt to prove what he had submitted. Vivian pressed him on why he had never fought the termination, never taken the company to court, never told anyone the truth in the 12 years since. Caleb answered simply that he had been young, without money for a lawyer, and raising a daughter alone, and that Blackthorn's legal team had threatened him with a lawsuit over trade secrets the moment he tried to speak publicly. He told her he chose his daughter's stability over his own vindication, though he had kept a private technical notebook from those years. One he had never been able to use because the flight recorder that would have corroborated his warnings had simply disappeared. Vivian felt the ground shifting slightly beneath her certainty, though she was not yet ready to admit how far it had already moved. At the laboratory, Dr. Vance confirmed that the recovered casing was authentic and precisely matched the model installed on the aircraft her father had died aboard. Elise pointed out fine scratch marks along the housing, consistent with manual removal using hand tools, evidence that directly contradicted the idea that the device had simply been thrown clear during the crash and drifted into the drainage system on its own. Someone, she said, had deliberately detached it from its mounting bracket and hidden it. By the end of the session, Elise reported that the internal memory board had survived largely intact, but that its security encryption had been tampered with using an internal Blackthorn Aeronautics access key, a detail that would eventually implicate someone far closer to the company than anyone in that room wanted to believe. Recovering the data took time, because the internal power cells had corroded and Elise needed to rebuild a stable current before she could even attempt to read the damaged memory sectors. Vivian stayed at the laboratory long past the hours she had promised her staff, missing preparatory meetings for the Vesper X9 launch that she would have considered unmissable only days earlier. Caleb assisted Elise where he could, identifying the older generation architecture of the recorder and helping map which sectors were most likely to hold usable audio. Vivian watched him work with quiet, practiced competence, and for the first time, she allowed herself to wonder how far his career might have gone if it had never been cut short. Elise worked with the patient precision of someone who understood that a single careless pass could destroy the only surviving trace of a man's final words. She adjusted the calibration twice, murmuring under her breath about signal degradation, while Vivian sat motionless in a plastic chair by the wall, her hands pressed together as if in prayer, though she had not prayed in years. Caleb stood near the doorway, giving her space without leaving her alone, understanding instinctively that some moments could not be rushed or softened. The first recovered fragment lasted only a few seconds, distorted by static and overlapping cockpit alarms, but it was enough. Vivian heard her father's voice for the first time in 12 years, and it was not the voice of a man barking reckless orders at a frightened pilot, as the official accident report had always claimed. Instead, Everett Blackthorne could be heard urgently instructing the pilot to turn the aircraft back toward Ashford, warning that the flight control system was not responding the way it should. Before the fragment cut off entirely, his voice returned once more, tense and clipped, mentioning that the actuator had been swapped for something that did not belong there. Gideon Blackthorne arrived at the laboratory not long after, accompanied by two of the company's senior attorneys, his manner warm toward his niece and immediately, unmistakably possessive toward the recorder itself. He expressed concern for Vivian's well-being in one breath and demanded custody of the device for the company's legal team in the next, framing it as protection rather than control. He reminded everyone in the room of Caleb's termination record, describing him as a disgruntled former employee whose motives could not be trusted, and then, almost casually, offered Caleb a substantial sum of money in exchange for signing a confidentiality agreement and walking away from the matter entirely. Caleb declined without hesitation, telling Gideon plainly that he did not sell the truth about dead men, no matter the price attached to his silence. Gideon's smile did not waver, but something behind his eyes did, and Vivian, watching her uncle closely for perhaps the first time in her life, felt the beginning of a doubt she did not yet have words for. He turned to her next, warning that if the crash investigation were reopened, the fallout could unravel everything the family had spent 12 years rebuilding, threatening thousands of jobs, every existing contract, and the entire future of the Vesper X9 program. Caleb did not try to force her hand, but he told her quietly that every time profit was placed above safety, another accident was already being assembled somewhere down the line, waiting for its moment. As Gideon turned to leave the laboratory, Caleb caught a brief glimpse of the signet ring on his hand, engraved with a small emblem belonging to a specialized engineering division within the company, the very same emblem stamped faintly onto the tampered access key used to encrypt the recorder's memory. Over the following days, Vivian quietly requested access to the company's oldest archived records, telling her assistant it was routine historical research and nothing more. What she found instead was a trail of edited maintenance logs connected to Flight BTA 417, all of them modified in the weeks after the crash. The final approval on each altered document traced back to Gideon Blackthorne, who at the time had served as the company's chief financial officer, years before he assumed control of the board. Buried within the financial records was an unusual payment sent to a parts supplier called North Star Motion Systems, a company Vivian had never once heard mentioned in 12 years of family conversation about her father's death. Caleb brought her his old technical notebook, the one he had kept hidden since his termination, and opened it to a page listing the original actuator's serial number alongside the serial number of the replacement part installed shortly before the crash. The replacement component did not appear anywhere on the list of parts approved by federal aviation regulators, meaning it had never been certified for use on a commercial aircraft at all. Caleb had signed off on his own inspection using the phrase "not airworthy," Yet the official digital record for that same inspection had somehow been altered to read fully inspected and approved, a change he had never authorized and had no way of reversing at the time. During one of their meetings at the airport, Caleb's daughter Mara stopped by briefly to bring him breakfast before her school day began, a small, ordinary moment that nonetheless struck Vivian with unexpected weight. Mara knew her father had once worked in aviation, but had never been told the full truth of what happened to his career, a truth Caleb had shielded her from so completely that she carried no resentment toward the industry that had discarded him. Watching them together, Vivian understood, perhaps for the first time, exactly what Caleb had sacrificed by staying silent, choosing a life of quiet dignity over a legal battle he could never have won alone. It was the clearest measure yet of the price this man had paid so that a 17-year-old girl could grow up without carrying her father's old wounds. Later that evening, Vivian apologized to Caleb for the way she had mocked him on the morning they first met, the words coming out stiffer than she intended but sincere all the same. Caleb accepted the apology without letting her hide behind it, telling her plainly that words only mattered if she was prepared to act on the truth they now shared. For the first time since their meeting, Vivian began to see him not as an employee beneath her or a stranger she had misjudged, but as someone standing entirely on equal footing with her, perhaps even several steps ahead. That shift in perspective would prove to be the true beginning of everything that followed. A search through her father's old calendar revealed a meeting scheduled with a federal aviation inspector for the very afternoon of the crash, a meeting whose subject line referenced unauthorized component substitutions within the Blackthorn fleet. The accident had occurred only hours before that meeting was set to take place. Vivian sat with that fact for a long time in the quiet of her office, finally understanding that her father had not died because of arrogance or recklessness, as she had been taught to believe for 12 long years. He had died on his way to expose a secret buried inside his own family's company. Not long after, a news article surfaced describing Caleb as a disgruntled former employee attempting to extort money from Blackthorn Aeronautics, complete with a doctored version of his old disciplinary file distributed to several outlets at once. A photograph of him collecting debris near the airport fence was circulated widely, framed as proof of a failed man grasping for relevance. Gideon publicly denied any involvement in leaking the story, yet the timing and precision of the campaign left little doubt about who was steering it from behind the scenes. At an emergency board meeting, several directors pressed Vivian to end the investigation entirely, warning that continued digging threatened to derail the Vesper X9 launch beyond repair. Gideon used the moment to question her judgment outright, suggesting that grief over her father was clouding her ability to lead the company rationally. A handful of board members floated the idea of suspending her authority unless she surrendered the recorder to internal counsel immediately, a suggestion Gideon did nothing to discourage. Vivian realized then that her uncle was not simply protecting an old secret anymore. He was maneuvering to remove her from power entirely before the truth could reach anyone who mattered. Caught between mounting pressure and her own uncertainty, Vivian asked Caleb to step back from the investigation temporarily, hoping to ease the media storm surrounding both of them. Caleb heard the request for exactly what it was, another instance of a company choosing its image over the truth, and told her so without softening the observation. He said she was repeating the very mistake made by everyone who had stayed silent 12 years earlier, and the accusation cut deeper than either of them expected. Vivian answered coldly, insisting she needed to handle matters in her own way, and Caleb left without argument, though something fragile between them had visibly cracked. Meanwhile, Elise detected an unauthorized remote attempt to access the laboratory's recovery system, a breach she managed to sever before any data could be altered or destroyed. She quickly created 3 separate encrypted backups of everything recovered so far, safeguarding the evidence against further tampering. A review of the airport's security footage showed that exactly 11 minutes of recording near the drainage access point had been deleted, and the access logs pointed directly to Owen Danner. It was becoming increasingly clear that Owen was not merely a bystander in whatever had happened 12 years ago, but an active participant who had never fully escaped its consequences. She thought of her father often during those tense days, replaying the fragment of his voice in her mind, until she could almost hear it without the static, until it became less a recording and more a compass pointing her toward the only decision she could live with. Rather than surrender the recorder to the board as instructed, Vivian secretly transferred an encrypted copy of the recovered audio to federal investigators, ensuring the evidence existed beyond her family's reach no matter what happened next. She still appeared at the public launch event as expected, allowing Gideon to believe she had quietly folded under pressure. Before the event began, she sent Caleb a short message telling him he had been right all along and that she needed his help to finish what they had started together. Caleb had not yet replied when Owen Danner appeared unannounced at his front door that evening, holding an old rusted key and wearing the expression of a man who could no longer carry a secret alone, telling Caleb plainly that he was the one who had thrown the black box into the drainage system all those years ago. Caleb invited him inside, and the 2 men sat across from each other at a small kitchen table while Mara slept upstairs, unaware that the final piece of her father's old life was about to surface only a few feet beneath her. Owen's hands trembled slightly as he set the rusted key down on the table, turning it once with his fingers as though the motion might help him find the right words. He had rehearsed this confession more times than he could count over the years, he admitted, but had never once found the courage to actually speak it aloud until now. Owen explained that in the chaotic hours after the crash, the largest surviving section of the aircraft had been brought to a sealed hangar at Ashford, arriving well before federal investigators could reach the scene. Gideon had gotten there first, citing the need to protect proprietary company technology, and instructed Owen personally to remove the flight recorder before anyone else laid eyes on it. Owen, believing at the time that he was simply protecting the company's interests, followed the order without asking questions he now deeply regretted never raising. When investigators arrived earlier than expected, panic took over, and Owen hid the recorder inside a maintenance vehicle rather than risk being caught carrying it in the open. He had planned to retrieve it quietly under cover of darkness, but the hangar area was placed under lockdown before he got the chance. In his fear, he dropped the recorder into an old drainage access point instead, assuming it would remain hidden indefinitely. Construction crews performing runway upgrades the following year unknowingly sealed the access point beneath a fresh layer of concrete, burying the device even deeper than Owen had intended. Gideon later told him the recorder had almost certainly been destroyed, instructing him to remain silent for good, a silence Owen carried for 12 years until a recent storm cracked an aging pipe and finally pushed the recorder back toward the surface where Caleb happened to find it. Owen handed Caleb a spare key to the sealed hangar, revealing that a portion of the wreckage had never actually been turned over to federal investigators as required by law. He also produced a copy of the original security directive bearing Gideon's signature, proof that the concealment had been ordered from the very top of the company. Caleb, still cautious, insisted that Owen record a formal statement and submit it directly to federal authorities, rather than relying on private conversation alone. Owen agreed without resistance, admitting he could no longer live comfortably with the weight of what he had done. The next morning, Caleb met Vivian at the airport, and she admitted that she had pushed him away out of fear of losing the company, not out of any real doubt in his integrity. Caleb told her that courage was never about being unafraid of loss, but about recognizing which things could never be traded away for safety or convenience. Together, they agreed not to enter the sealed hangar on their own, choosing instead to request that federal investigators secure and inventory the site themselves. It was a decision that kept the remaining evidence legally sound and prevented their pursuit of the truth from collapsing into reckless, unsupported action. While reviewing the hangar's original evidence log, Caleb discovered a listing for a replacement actuator bearing a serial number that did not match the number recorded anywhere in the official crash investigation report. Under the direct supervision of federal investigators, Vivian, Caleb, and Elise were finally granted access to the long-sealed hangar, its air stale and metallic after 12 years of undisturbed silence. Dust hung suspended in the beams of the investigators' flashlights, and the vast space felt less like a storage facility than a tomb that had been waiting patiently for someone brave enough to open it. Vivian's footsteps echoed against the concrete floor, and she found herself walking slower than the others, as though some part of her still expected to find her father standing somewhere among the shadows. Caleb stayed close but said nothing, letting her absorb the weight of the room in her own time, understanding better than most what it meant to finally stand inside a truth that had been sealed away for so long. Inside, they located the actuator recovered from the wreckage, its housing stamped with markings from North Star Motion Systems rather than any certified aerospace manufacturer. Elise's inspection revealed premature metal fatigue along its internal components, evidence that the part had never been built to withstand the heat and pressure of sustained commercial flight. The evidence seal on the original storage container had been quietly replaced at some point with a seal belonging to a division of the company under Gideon's direct control. Working through the final corrupted sectors of the recorder, Elise managed to reconstruct 43 seconds of audio no one had ever been meant to hear. In it, Everett Blackthorne could be heard clearly stating that he had just discovered the aircraft's actuator had been swapped for an unauthorized part without his knowledge or approval. He instructed the pilot to attempt an emergency return to Ashford immediately and told an assistant somewhere near him to ensure the relevant documents reached federal inspectors no matter what happened next. In the final moments before the recording ended, Everett spoke his brother Gideon's name directly, saying he could no longer continue shielding him from the consequences of what he had allowed to happen. There was no evidence in that recording, nor anywhere else, suggesting Gideon had intentionally caused the crash itself. His guilt lay instead in knowingly permitting a dangerously substandard part to remain installed and concealing that knowledge for 12 years rather than accepting the consequences. As the aircraft lost the last of its controllable systems, Everett recorded one final message intended for his daughter, telling her that if she ever heard these words, she must never let the Blackthorne name become a reason to fear the truth. Vivian absorbed the message in silence, her grief visible but restrained, refusing to let it collapse into spectacle even in front of the people who now knew her family's darkest secret. Caleb stood beside her without offering hollow comfort, understanding that some moments required presence rather than words. It was in that stillness that Vivian truly released the polished, untouchable image of the perfect heiress she had spent her entire adult life constructing, choosing instead to become the kind of leader who could carry real responsibility. She understood now, with total clarity, that Caleb had never been the man threatening to destroy her father's legacy. He was, in fact, the only person capable of helping her save whatever honest part of that legacy still remained intact. Before the emergency board session could even begin, Gideon announced that the board had already voted to suspend Vivian from her position as chief executive. Gideon stood before the assembled board, with the calm confidence of a man who believed he had already won, declaring that Vivian was no longer fit to lead the company through such a turbulent moment. He characterized the entire investigation as an emotional overreaction, suggesting she had allowed a manipulative former employee to cloud her professional judgment entirely. Caleb was stopped at the building's entrance and denied access on the grounds that he no longer held any official standing within the company. Vivian entered the boardroom anyway, asserting her standing as both a major shareholder and the founder's own daughter, a right no one in that room could legally deny her. The room fell silent as she opened her folder, the kind of silence that settles over people who sense the ground shifting beneath them before they can name why. Vivian did not raise her voice or perform for the room the way Gideon had. She simply spoke, methodically, the way her father once had, laying each piece of evidence on the table like a foundation being rebuilt stone by stone. One by one, she laid out the evidence that could no longer be dismissed or buried. There was the recorder itself, recovered in full view of a witness with a documented time and location. There were the tool marks proving deliberate removal rather than accidental loss during the crash. There was Caleb's original technical notebook containing the unaltered serial numbers he had recorded years before anyone thought to question them. There were the digitally modified maintenance logs, traced conclusively back to Gideon's own authorization. There was the substandard actuator itself, recovered intact from the sealed hangar evidence locker. There was the original security directive bearing his signature, ordering the recorder's removal in the hours after the crash. There was Owen's recorded statement, corroborating every detail of what had happened that night. And finally, there were the reconstructed 43 seconds from inside the cockpit itself, carrying her father's own voice as undeniable testimony. Gideon insisted, his composure finally beginning to fracture, that every decision he had made was intended solely to protect the company and everyone whose livelihood depended on it. Vivian answered that a company could only be protected through honest standards and accountability, never through the quiet sacrifice of an innocent man's reputation and career. Federal investigators formally announced that the crash investigation was being reopened based on the newly recovered evidence. The board voted immediately to suspend Gideon and freeze every remaining channel of his authority within the company. He was not removed from the building in handcuffs that day, but escorted out to continue cooperating with federal investigators, a resolution that kept the moment grounded in reality rather than manufactured drama. Before the meeting concluded, Vivian invited Caleb into the boardroom, standing before the very people who had once dismissed him as disposable. In front of the entire board, she acknowledged plainly that Blackthorn Aeronautics had destroyed his career and his reputation 12 years earlier for the crime of telling the truth. She apologized publicly, without hedging, for the way she had mocked him the morning she first mistook him for nothing more than a man scavenging for scrap. Caleb took no satisfaction in watching his former employer humbled. He asked only that the company formally restore the record of every technician who had ever been forced into silence to protect a convenient story. The board offered him a substantial financial settlement in recognition of what he had endured, but Caleb told them plainly that money could never repair a system if the people running it refused to change how they operated. Word of the investigation spread quickly through the industry, and other technicians who had once been quietly pushed out for raising uncomfortable warnings began coming forward with stories of their own, emboldened by the fact that someone had finally been believed. In the months that followed, federal investigators formally confirmed that the crash had resulted from an uncertified component failure combined with a deliberate cover-up of the original inspection findings. Gideon faced serious charges including fraud, obstruction of a federal investigation, and falsification of official aviation records. The scandal damaged Blackthorn Aeronautics' public reputation significantly, though Vivian's decision to embrace full transparency ultimately kept the company from total collapse. The Vesper X9 launch was postponed indefinitely, while an independent team conducted a complete safety review of every system across the fleet. Vivian accepted the financial cost without hesitation, choosing honest disclosure over another decade of concealment. It was a slow, quiet kind of justice, the sort that rarely made headlines but mattered enormously to the people living inside it. Caleb's original personnel record was formally corrected to reflect the truth of what had actually happened 12 years earlier. Her father's name was publicly cleared of the long-standing accusation that he had pressured his flight crew into a dangerous, unnecessary takeoff. Vivian established a support fund for the families of aviation accident victims, along with a formal protection program for industry whistleblowers who chose to speak up despite the professional risk. She did not attempt to repaint her father as a flawless man, but she made certain both his failures and his final act of courage were part of the record the public would remember. Vivian offered Caleb the position of honorary vice president, but he declined a title that would function as little more than decoration. Instead, he requested a role with the actual authority to ground any aircraft the moment a genuine safety concern was identified, regardless of schedule or cost. He became the company's new director of technical integrity and flight safety, a position built entirely around substance rather than symbolism. He agreed to take the job only once Vivian guaranteed his department would report directly to the board and to outside regulatory oversight, free from any internal interference. It was recognition earned through competence and sacrifice, never granted out of guilt or pity. The bond between Caleb and Vivian did not transform into romance overnight, nor did the story rush them toward a conclusion neither of them had earned. Instead, trust grew steadily through shared hangar inspections, long, candid conversations, and disagreements they were no longer afraid to have honestly in front of each other. Mara appeared only briefly again, at a small ceremony held to formally restore her father's professional honor. Her presence kept light, so the story's focus remained on the larger truth being uncovered rather than on her. For the first time in years, Vivian found something resembling family, not within the walls of the Blackthorn estate, but in the steady, uncomplicated honesty of a man she had once dismissed without a second thought. The fog had returned that morning too, thinner now, drifting low across the tarmac the way it always did before the sun climbed high enough to burn it away. Several months later, at 5 a.m, Vivian once again saw Caleb crouched near the same stretch of runway, carefully lifting a small loose bolt from the gravel exactly as he had the first time they met. This time, she did not laugh or mock him from a distance. She crouched down beside him instead and picked up a small piece of metal debris of her own, turning it over in her hand the way he always did. Caleb told her that even the smallest object could change the course of an entire aircraft if it was ignored long enough. Vivian looked out toward the pale horizon and answered quietly that a single small truth could do exactly the same thing to an entire empire. 12 years earlier, a black box had been buried to protect a family name from the weight of what it had done. In the end, it was the very man that family had thrown away who dug it back up, and in doing so, saved the only part of that legacy still worth keeping.